if I went back with my current knowledge that I've acquired and my current computing setup that I've got, and I went back to 2010 and started designing cars for World Time Attack Challenge or something like that, even with their power levels, like you would go and absolutely wipe the floor.
Welcome to the HPA Tuned In podcast. I'm Andre, your host, and in this episode, we're joined by Kyle Forster from JKF Aero. Kyle is an aerodynamicist born and bred in Australia with a PhD in aerodynamics. He's worked at the top echelons of motorsport, including a stint at the Mercedes AMG F1 team as an aerodynamicist during their successful run at the beginning of the hybrid era. Since leaving Formula 1, he's moved back to Australia and now concentrates on his aero consulting business, where he consults for club-level competitors as well as professional race teams and even OE manufacturers. Now, it's no secret that with the likes of World Time Attack, we've seen just how critical a properly designed aero package has become in extracting the ultimate lap time out of a car. I think for a lot of us, though, at the club level, looking from the outside in, would think that if we don't have hundreds of thousands of dollars to spend and access to a wind tunnel, or maybe at least expensive and advanced CFD software, then getting worthwhile gains from an aero package is probably unrealistic. Kyle explains to us, though, that nothing could be further from the truth, and with a good understanding of aerodynamic principles and applying best practice standards to club-level race cars, we can actually get exceptional results and a really worthwhile improvement in our lap times. We also talked to Kyle about what it actually takes to become an aerodynamicist, the path that he's gone down, and how difficult it is to break into Formula 1 from the Southern Hemisphere. Before we jump into our chat, for those who are new to the Tuned In podcast, High Performance Academy is an online training school. We specialize in teaching people how to build performance engines, how to tune EFI, how to construct wiring harnesses. We also cover topics on fabrication, 3D modeling and CAD, race driver education, and data logging, just to name a few. You can find all of our courses at hpacademy.com/courses. All of these courses are delivered in high-definition video modules that you can watch from anywhere in the world, provided you've got an internet connection. This means you can learn from the comfort of your own place and you can learn at your own pace. All of our courses also come with a 60-day, no questions asked, money-back guarantee. So if you purchase them for any reason at all, decide it wasn't quite what you expected, no problem, let us know. We'll give you a full refund. And for podcast listeners, you can also use the coupon code podcast75. That will get you $75 off the purchase of your very first HPA course. We'll put the coupon code in the show notes to make it nice and easy for you to find. Lastly, if you like free stuff, then I've got a great deal for you. We are constantly partnering with some of the biggest names in the aftermarket performance industry to give away some great prizes. You can always find our latest prize at hpacademy.com/giveaway. It might be an aftermarket ECU or dash. It could be some engine components or engine building tools, or just about anything in between. They are great prizes, and we will ship them free of charge to your door if you're the winner. There's no tricks here, no purchase required to get your name into the draw. All right, enough with our introduction. Let's get into our interview now. All right, welcome to the podcast, Kyle. Thanks for joining us. And as we always do, I want to start by finding out a little bit about your background and how you formed an interest, initially at least, in cars.
Yeah, so unlike a lot of engineering people I know, I didn't actually have any engineers as such in my family. My family background's actually in finance.
Right.
And despite that, though, they were also all really into like petrol-powered things like cars, racing boats, motorbikes, stuff like that. So Dad used to take me go-karting as a kid fairly frequently. He bought me a little Nitro RC car when I was young. Taught me a fair bit about engines, little car things like suspension, stuff like that. And we had a race boat, which was a pretty cool thing to have as a kid.
Yeah, that's not the normal upbringing, but I'm here for it.
Yeah. No, it was pretty handy. But even despite that, when I started going through high school, like early high school, I actually wanted to be a video game designer and come up with cool things in video games. But then it was basically brought to my attention that instead of doing that, I could just make cool things in real life.
Yeah.
And the obvious way to do that is to become an engineer. So going on through that high school, we had this subject called power systems, which was basically just like the study of cars, essentially. And so the school I was at is quite an engineering focused school, and it had like a old like Ford Cortina and a Land Cruiser Troopy, and basically the subject was just like tearing those apart, putting them back together, taking lawnmower engines apart and rebuilding those. And that obviously got me my first sort of real knowledge around cars that allowed me to sort of develop that later. So I had this big engineering passion growing from all that and through high school. And so I decided to do engineering at university. And I was basically thinking like, what's the engineering that's the coolest and the highest level? And so I went for aerospace engineering.
Right. Straight to the top shelf.
Yeah, basically. And at that time, I had a real interest in aircraft and also an interest in cars. So aerospace felt like a good option to me because I could go to either motorsport off the back of it, because modern motorsport at the top tier is really closer to aerospace engineering than anything else, or I could go into planes.
So you've covered your bases.
Yeah, basically. And while I was going through that university degree, I decided I would join the FSAE team or Formula Student to get more of that sort of motorsport experience and learn more about race cars from that. So as I was getting deeper and deeper through university, I basically decided that aerodynamics was starting to look really cool as a concept thing. I loved how airflow worked and finding out the mechanisms around that. And I applied that to a little bit of development in Formula Student. At that time, we didn't really have all the massive wings that they have now, but just sort of doing some early CFD on that.
I guess maybe just pause you there and give us a sense of what sort of time frame are we talking? What year is this?
Yes. So when I was in Formula Student, that would have been, 2009, 2010-ish? That sort of period. So it was like the very dawn of the winged era, where you had Monash Motorsport was just starting to roll their big fat, well, they're not starting to roll. They had rolled their big fat wings out, but no one else really had wings on their cars. Well, very few other teams had wings on their cars.
On that note, just without trying to get too sidetracked, but just of interest to me here, why was there an era where Formula SAE didn't really have aerodynamic devices? I mean, I would have imagined that you'd be looking to Formula One as a bit of inspiration, and obviously clearly Formula One's been deep into aerodynamics well prior to that. Or was it rules, or you're kind of just doing what all the other teams are doing and no one's doing it, so that's fine?
No, so I think like certainly in the Australian competition at that point in time, there was a constant debate going on as to whether or not wings were of value on a course, where basically you had the option of either making a very light, mechanically grip-focused car, or you could try and go for an aerodynamic approach, but they were quite heavy. So at the time, we had quite a lightweight honeycomb car, which I think was around 175 kilograms. So a very light car at that point. Whereas Monash was running something that was more a space frame car. And I think they were in sort of like around, I want to say like 210, 220 kilos, maybe even more.
It's pretty significant when you look at it from a percentage standpoint as well.
Yeah, I think though that there was a lot of stuff going on in, obviously it's a student-led competition, right? So not everyone has the resources or skills or knowledge to really flesh out good quality lap simulation tools. So there wasn't quite the availability of, I guess these days there's a lot of availability of resource around lap simulation, around software and things like that.
So now you could basically run a simulation as a 210 kilogram car that provides XYZ downforce, ultimately going to be faster than a 175 kilogram car with little to no downforce, that sort of thing?
Yeah. And the thing is, like, you could fundamentally run that then, and like teams did run stuff like that back then, but it just required a little bit more effort to set up and wasn't as well done across everyone. So we'd run lap simulations and we thought that going wingless was the correct approach. And some of our cars were fairly competitive, even without wings. So If you have a look even at like the UWA, so University of Western Australia era, where they were really dominant back then, those cars were wingless and they were really fast. They went over to Europe and they did incredibly well in the European competitions. So it wasn't so clear cut, whereas now obviously everyone's realized you just max the aero and you can go crazy fast.
Sure. Just one thing that popped into mind while you're talking there, and I guess we're going to talk about this more as we go anyway, but the effectiveness of aerodynamic devices is going to be tied into or correlated to the speed of the vehicle. So I have not been involved with Formula SAE. Are these sort of events that you compete in sort of low enough in speed to make the aero not a clear-cut winner? Or is that not really factor into it?
No, the thing with low speed, when you have a lower speed event, is that as the speeds get lower and lower, the real trick to aerodynamics is just to go harder and harder on making maximum downforce, because you don't need to target max efficiency because drag doesn't matter so much. So you can have these really, really draggy aero packages that make a bunch of downforce, and at low speed, that's a really positive thing. So if you're going to have the weight to have the structure and the packaging constraints of having an aerodynamics kit, then you want to make a ton of downforce. And the rules back when I was doing it actually had huge rules boxes for the wings. So if you go back and have a look at photographs of winged Formula SAE cars from that era, the wings are huge compared to what they are now. Like there was one time where I was pulling an all-nighter repairing the car at Monish's workshop, and I actually slept on one of their wings of their old cars because it was big enough that you could literally just like curl up into a ball on it and just sleep there.
I mean, it still doesn't sound comfortable, but yeah, it's a good graphic of the size of it anyway.
Yeah, exactly. The other thing too that's worth mentioning is that the FSAE teams back then were, at least from my experience, smaller and less well-resourced than they are now. So our FSAE team, I think, had officially on the books like 25 members or so, but the reality is that there were maybe 10 people actually like making the car. And whereas now, like some of the teams are like my same team that I was in is now, I think, 120 members or 150 members.
Wow.
So big differences in resourcing. And what that means is that back then, if you were going to make a wing package for the car, it meant that you had to devote 1-2 people on that. And all of a sudden, your build resource on just making your suspension and your frame and stuff like that massively takes a hit.
So it's all about prioritizing your resources to get the best possible result.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. Well, we sidetracked that and derailed everything pretty quickly, so we'll get back on. Obviously, we've got the sense now. You're sort of involved in that Formula SAE team. So how did the passion and knowledge with aero sort of grow off the back of that?
Yeah, so continuing along later in university, I leveled up in the Formula SAE team. I became the technical director of the team. So I was kind of just doing a little bit of everything on that car at that point. I also was doing quite well academically at that point. So I'd started specializing in aero. We got to the end of the university degree and I felt like going to Formula One was probably the logical path for me. At the end of my degree, I actually won the university medal, which is basically like it's if you're the number one person in the cohort.
Wow.
So I was looking like I was quite a promising candidate for Formula One. I knew another guy that had gotten into F1, into Red Bull via like connections that he knew because he won Formula One in schools. And I thought that was definitely the go. However, at that point, it was becoming pretty obvious to me that just leaving from a university in Australia with just an undergraduate degree was not going to result in me even getting an interview at Formula One. Basically, you either need to be going to one of the universities that they choose from. So F1 teams tend to pick from specific universities with a little bit of bias there.
Sure.
So you either need to be going to one of those or you need to have a higher level of degree, whether that's at a minimum, a master's, usually a master's in motorsport or a PhD. And that's just to get you in the door. That's just to get you to have an interview at that point.
Wow. I mean, I guess it makes sense. You're looking at the pinnacle of motorsport, and I'm guessing within reason, most of these teams are sort of spoilt for choice with potential candidates.
Yeah. They've got a huge number of applicants coming in for these sorts of roles. So they've got tons of candidates. They've got universities that they have historically chosen from that they're generally pretty happy with. They also all have industrial placement programs. So they'll pick, like, a lot of the people that go into their departments come from their industrial placement programs. So all those things together mean that if you're coming from a country like Australia and you don't have a direct contact in F1, which at that point in time, I had no decently high level direct contacts in F1, then I think the odds of me even getting an interview were absolutely minuscule.
Yeah, makes sense.
Yeah. So basically, I knew I needed to do higher education. So the obvious choice to me was to go for a PhD, because my results in university essentially allowed me to skip doing a master's and then stepping into a PhD.
Could you just give, for those who sort of aren't involved in tertiary education and beyond, could you give us a bit of an understanding on what a degree, a master's and a PhD actually entails? What do these things even mean?
Yep. So basically, obviously, you leave high school, you decide to go to university to get a higher level of education. So that first degree that you're going to do is called a bachelor's degree. In my particular case, the bachelor's degree in aerospace engineering is a 4-year degree. That's the minimum time. It can take you longer if you spread it out or if you don't do as many subjects. Different countries do have slightly different ways they play things. I think America might be 5 years or so, but they have their first year as more like a general education year. I think UK might have 3 years for some of those courses, if I'm not mistaken, but that's the rough time period. At the end of that, you get your bachelor's degree, and that's just like your base level university degree. You can then have honors on top of that. Some people do honors as an extra year as thesis. At my university I was at, the thesis was mandatory. So you had to do a thesis in your final year, which is basically just a large report where you go and do a big research project. So in my particular one, for example, I was looking at the applications of vortex generators on race car wings. And so I did some wind tunnel testing, some on-car testing, and some CFD testing. And that then gives you your honors. And you can have different classes of honors. So you can have like honors class 1, which is the highest, or you can have like a 2, a 2A, blah, 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 blah. And so that's your base bachelor's degree with your honors. Then you have a master's, which is like the next level up. Masters are usually not that long a degree. They can be 1.5 to 2 years sort of thing. And it's just a slightly more specialized degree. You can do a master's by coursework or research. So master's by coursework is you just studying more. Master's by research is you actually looking into researching a new problem or something like that. And that gives you a master's. And then the other one is a PhD, which is also known as a doctorate, which is around 3 to 4 years. I think 3 years is the minimum time. Some people take much longer than that. They can take like 5 years, 6 years. And a PhD is basically you try to find a new research problem that no one else has looked into or solved. And then you go and study what is really on face value quite a small problem in terms of its specificity. And you become basically the global expert on that problem by researching that very specific problem in great depth. And once you've researched that, then if your research is valuable and you have a thesis that is of merit, you can then get your doctorate, and then you get the title of doctor, you have a PhD, and that's basically the level you're at.
Okay. And that's the angle to get you the best shot of getting into a Formula One team?
Yes. So,
well, with your specific trajectory, at least.
I was of the opinion at the time that it was, and right now I'm still of the opinion that without that PhD, I wouldn't have gotten in the door. So I firmly stand by that, coming from Australia.
Yeah, I think that makes sense. You're on the wrong side of the world for Formula One teams. You really need to be in sort of that motorsport alley in the UK, ideally, I guess, or at least in close proximity.
Yeah. I think that unless you are very lucky with a number of other circumstances, I think that it's very hard to go from halfway across the world to do something like that.
Oh, well, jumping ahead a little bit. Obviously, you did make that leap and you got a position with the Mercedes F1 team. How difficult with your PhD was it to actually land that job in the end? Was that sort of pretty plain sailing or still hard work?
So it's a little bit of a funny one where one of my PhD supervisors was ex-Formula One. So towards the end of my PhD, two things happened. One was I teed up, with the help of this supervisor, a presentation with Renault Formula One, and basically did a presentation of my research to them. The other thing was I entered in this random engineering competition. It was just this completely weird online multiple choice quiz competition. And that actually won me tickets to go and visit Williams. So I actually won a visit to Williams. And so I did that all on the same trip. And I did all this presentation and all that. I thought that this might have gotten me some contacts, might have gotten me to get some inside run on a job. But the reality is that absolutely nothing came from that. So then I was back home, approaching the end of my PhD, and I was just starting to just cold fire for job applications because I had no contacts. So there was no other option. So there was a job going at Red Bull for an aerodynamicist, and so I cold applied for that. Never heard back from it. And then there was a job going at Mercedes, and so I submitted for that. And basically, they got back to me fairly soon after I submitted, just cold application. We had one interview over the phone, and then a couple of weeks later, I had another interview over Skype, just an hour and a half interview with a few different people there. And then, they offered me the job straight up, and that was that.
Wow. The rest is history.
Yeah, it was quite funny because I always thought it would either be more involved a process or it would be you definitely need to know people to get in. But no, it was just as simple as a regular job application.
Well, as simple as a regular job application after a lot of hard work at university.
Yeah. Well, there was that, and also through my whole PhD, I was doing a lot of consulting work, and we didn't really talk about this, but I built my own race car at that point as well. So I had a lot of, in my CV, I actually had at the back of it, I had a picture of basically, a series of pictures of all the different cars that I'd done, which I think probably grabbed their interest.
Yeah, in other words, you had a fair few runs on the board at that point.
Yeah. And I think that certainly helped a lot and made the application stand out a bit more.
Okay. Right, I kind of want to dive into the world of Formula One, and I'll preface this with clearly there's probably more you can't talk about than what you can talk about. So we'll try and keep this kind of high level without being kind of specific to your team or Mercedes F1. But coming in particularly as a brand new sort of recruit, albeit you've got a lot of experience, as you've already explained, what are your sort of roles in that first sort of 6 to 12 months? Are you kind of being assessed as to how useful you are within the team and how much sort of control they give you, I guess? Or how does that work?
So obviously you come in fairly junior, and even with that, I'd say you still get thrown pretty heavily in the deep end. It's a very steep learning curve when you first join because you think you know things like CFD and wind tunnel testing and stuff like that. But the reality is that when you get to the F1 team, everything's all a little bit different. They care, at least on the aero development side, which is what I was in, which is basically designing the aerodynamic parts of the car. They care a lot less about sort of the in-depth theory of how some of that stuff works and far more on just the practical aspects. And what that means is that because you've got that focus shift, the practical things, they have all these different ways of doing stuff and working out performance that are very different to what you can think of prior to coming into F1.
So you sort of have to relearn that direction, kind of.
Yeah. Well, there was just a huge amount to learn in terms of assessment tools. So what are you doing to work out what's going on with your data? What are you actually looking for in terms of performance? Because what I used to look for performance in terms of what an aerodynamic part adds, I'd be looking on my consulting projects, I'd be like, oh yeah, we added downforce at a certain drag, that's cool. It's a gain. But in F1, you're looking so much about what are the characteristics of parts? What's happening with all these different little details? What's the development potential? So there's a lot of things you don't think about. And then the other thing too that people don't really talk about too much, but just the CAD surfacing of some of the components is a pretty big step up from anything they'll teach you in university. Some of the generating of the three-dimensional surfaces is quite complicated. So that there's all of those things together, all made for a very steep learning curve, in addition to the fact that obviously for me, I was being in a new country, even though England and Australia, you'd think are quite similar, there's definitely some cultural barriers there as well.
No doubt.
And obviously F1's a little bit of a melting pot. You've got a lot of people from around Europe. So you're trying to deal with all of that at the same time as you have a massive technical load. And so the first 6 months for me were incredibly difficult.
I can understand that.
Yeah. And then after that, though, in terms of your question about like what responsibilities do they give you, for me, they started me on a certain area of the car for the first 6 months, where obviously they were getting me to develop an area that was notoriously hard to develop. I think because they kind of assumed I wouldn't be able to put much performance on it. And for the first 6 months, that was the case. I didn't really do anything that significant in terms of adding performance. But then as I started to get a grasp of all the systems, I did start to add a reasonable chunk of performance. And then I got shifted to different parts of the car and got more exposure on different sub areas of the car. And then I started to add quite a lot of performance at that point. And I think at that point, people were starting to notice. And so I was getting progressively more and more responsibility of different parts on the car. So that was a very exciting time.
Yeah. Just so we can get a bit of a sense of how this works, could you give us an idea on maybe approximately how many people inside of the team are on the aero team?
Yeah, so every team's laid out a little bit differently and has slightly different sizes. And obviously I can't be too specific about the sizes, but you can do a little bit of working things out on LinkedIn, certainly. So you might have in a team, you might have an aero department of, say, let's call it, 30 aerodynamicists, right? And then you'll have those guys split into different development groups. So you might have a front car development group, mid car development group, a rear car development group, and a concept development group, for example. Every team split is slightly different on these, so they don't all work the same way. You'll then have a bunch of supporting staff. So obviously the aerodynamicists are the ones coming up with the surfaces, but the support staff have to go through and actually turn the surfaces into parts. So you'll have people that are working on making your stuff into wind tunnel model parts, so actually manufacturing the parts, changing your surfaces into parts that can be made for the wind tunnel, making sure that any sort of instrumentation stuff is sorted out, all the people making sure that the CFD models and the computing systems are all working effectively, making sure that all your software tools are all working effectively. So you'll have a bunch of people for all different tasks within the team. So an aero department could be 70 to 100 people. Ballpark, again, varies a fair bit team to team.
Yeah, of course. Yeah, one of the questions off the back of that is, how do you end up, when you've got that many aerodynamicists working within the department, how do you end up with a cohesive design where, you mentioned the front end, the middle, the rear, the concept? How do you make all of these talk to each other so you've got this cohesive design and it doesn't look like one person's designed the front wing, another person's designed the underbody, and someone else has designed the rear wing, and they've never talked to each other?
Well, this is actually the great part. If you go and have a look at, like a 2020 car or something like that, and you look at the front and the rear, they aren't cohesive.
So the problem's real.
Yeah. Well, it's also kind of not a problem, if that makes sense. Like if the front is feeding, well, I guess I should split this into two things. There are some things where you need, the rear end might need a certain front flow structure sent to it. In that case, you obviously need to have communications between the front and the rear teams.
Yeah, I could kind of see you could make a front wing that provides the required downforce with the required drag, and you could do the same at the back of the car. But if the flow off the front of the car then provides dirty, low energy air to that rear wing, it's not actually going to perform as a complete package.
Yeah, I think that certainly with the main rule set that I worked on, the primary objective is always the same, which is stuff upstream should make as much downforce as possible while sending as clean airflow to the rear as possible. So if the rear has cleaner airflow sent to it, generally speaking, it's going to be happier, pretty much regardless of what's going on. So if there's more energy at the rear team is happy. So the front's always going to try to achieve that. Now, the newer rule set, I say that obviously with respect to the fact that rules are about to change next year, but the current rule set, you've got a lot of interactions between the front and the rear through the floor tunnel. Certainly with the tunnel itself, there's some big vortex generators at the front that are creating very large scale structures with a high level of persistence to the rear of the car. So there would be a lot more interaction front and rear and planning front and rear required there. You might have a group breakdown where you have a group that looks at, say, the floor from front to rear. So looking at the shaping of the floor along the entire floor. And then you might have the rear end group might be separate to that and might just be looking at, say, the detail work on the diffuser. So just doing like little flicks and local curvatures and things like that. So the split, I obviously can't comment on how the teams are split right now, but I would imagine there's a decent amount of interaction front to rear.
Okay. If you're a fan of the podcast and you're interested in topics like engine tuning, automotive wiring, performance engine building, 3D modeling in CAD, or anything else in the high-performance industry, I have something that you might be interested in. Introducing the High Performance Academy VIP package. This package of courses gives you lifetime access to all of HPA's online training for one price. These courses cover everything from tuning and reflashing petrol and diesel engines through to motorsport wiring, engine building, fabrication, design, car setup, and plenty more. Right now, you can get $500 off High Performance Academy's VIP package using the code PODCAST500 at checkout. Becoming a VIP means you'll never pay for another course again. You'll get instant access to all 40 plus courses we currently offer, plus every new course we ever release in the future. Want to define maps or tune with WinOLS? Curious about CAN bus devices or how CAD can help make your dream build a reality? These in-depth topics, as well as many others, each have their own dedicated course that are going to help you master whatever it is you want to learn. And as a VIP member, you're not just getting the courses, you'll also join HPA's online community with lifetime access to our member forums and members' webinar lessons. Again, the code is podcast500 for that $500 discount. Just head over to hpacademy.com to check out the full VIP package and everything it contains. All right, let's get back to the episode. In terms of sort of how you develop these aerodynamic devices and then the iterative improvements that you go through, I mean, obviously Formula One have curtailed a lot of the testing to keep costs down, particularly around wind tunnel testing. So as I understand it, you've kind of got CFD, which you lean on heavily with your initial design iterations, but then at some point the parts need to actually be proven in the wind tunnel as well. Have I kind of got that process about right?
Yeah. So generally speaking, you will develop things in CFD, which is like the sort of first line tool once you've done the design, because it's kind of the lowest effort. And then from there, you'll go and run things in the wind tunnel to basically see what's the best in the tunnel, because the CFD and the wind tunnel usually don't agree, and what's good in CFD is often not good in the wind tunnel, and vice versa. And you're going to pick whatever tool is closest to the track and closest to giving you real performance, and then develop for that.
Okay. Again, coming from obviously a complete novice at this, that's surprising. I would have assumed at least a moderate degree of correlation between CFD and the wind tunnel, and then also some degree of correlation, probably a high degree of correlation between wind tunnel and real world track testing. So not the case. What causes the sort of disconnect here?
So basically the flow fields around something like a Formula One car are really complex. They're some of the most complex flow fields you can get. And you can't effectively resolve a lot of what's going on in CFD. And that's really true for anything where you might have a small flow separation, where you've got any sort of vortex or anything like that, or any unstable flow. The second you've got a degree of instability, CFD kind of falls apart. Once you have a whole bunch of complexity and a bunch of small instabilities, that falls apart. And so there's plenty of things where you might do something that in CFD triggers, say, a vortex to blow up, right? So let's say I have a vortex coming out the rear of the car, and I do some change in CFD that powers up something upstream, and that causes that vortex to blow up. That will cause a significant loss in downforce. So CFD might be, say, 30 points down. Points are just a unit we use for downforce. But then I go into the wind tunnel, and that vortex actually doesn't blow up. the CFD has gotten the instabilities wrong, and it says that the vortex is hanging on. So then the wind tunnel has then instead rewarded the extra suction we made with that stronger vortex upstream. And so in the wind tunnel, we're actually 4 points up. So that is not uncommon. I would say that's actually probably the most common scenario.
The first thing that jumps to my mind when you go through that scenario you've just explained is, if CFD is saying you're 30 points down, why would you ever consider then testing that component in the wind tunnel? That, to my mind, again, from a complete novice standpoint, would sound like a bad idea, wasting a bunch of expensive wind tunnel testing.
Yeah, I would say that of all the options I submitted to the tunnel that were gains, probably 70 to 80% of them were down in CFD.
Okay. So does this then just come from your experience? You know the limitations of the CFD, so you can be pretty sure that while CFD is saying you're going the wrong direction, your experience and gut saying, no, I think this is going the right direction, it is worthy of testing.
Yeah, I think that you can spot trends pretty well and work out what's going on, and then you can know what's going on there. I think there is also something to be said though for CFD, and this is certainly an approach that I take more these days now that I don't get tunnel access as frequently. But CFD can be a good predictor of problems on track that don't yet exist in the wind tunnel, because track can be really variable aerodynamic conditions. So you don't always have perfect correlation track to wind tunnel. So I might go and let's say I've got a bad separation in CFD, but it's not showing up in the tunnel. I might look at that and be like, this separation doesn't look super great. I don't love the look of this, and it's only, say, half a point up in the tunnel. This might not be a good characteristic to bring to track. So that's somewhere where you might not consider going down that path. But yeah, apart from that, if you have experience in what CFD does and doesn't tell you, how that compares to track, how that compares to tunnel, you can make a really educated decision on what you want to send, because you're not looking for the outright downforce in CFD. You're looking for an effect. And if I see the effect that I like, I'm going to put that to the car. And that's something that I do even to this day, that I don't strictly look at the CFD numbers and think, oh yeah, that part was 6 points up in CFD, I'm going to put that on my client's car. I will always be like, do I like that flow feature? And if I don't like it, it won't go on the car.
Okay, I think that's a really interesting insight. I would have assumed, as a lot of other people probably do as well, that CFD does have a very close correlation, and you're using it more for the outright results as opposed to the direction, as you sort of pointed out. So yeah, really interesting to learn that. You just mentioned as well that the wind tunnel doesn't always correlate well to actual real world track, which is obviously the be all and end all, is what the car does on the racetrack. Can you give us a little bit more depth into why that's the case? I mean, I could probably assume that the car's moving around a lot more on the track than it is in a wind tunnel, in terms of, obviously the ride height's always changing. I want to get into ride height sensitivity shortly. I guess you've got wind as well. What else is there that plays into this?
Yeah, so you've got, there's a few things. You've got, like you mentioned, there's the variable wind and variable ride height, but some of that you can already resolve in the tunnel. The model, there's plenty of videos on YouTube of F1 teams running car models in the tunnel these days, and you can see that the model, to put it in change the ride heights, things like that. So that you can resolve a fair bit. There's a few other little bits and pieces that have been discussed a bit lately around, like ground roughness, for example, where the roughness of the ground in the tunnel and roughness on track is always a little bit different. So there's some variation there. The tires you get on the wind tunnel model are not real tires, so they don't behave the same as real tires. So they have different shapes, which can have different effects. Also, deflections of bodywork are not the same wind tunnel to track. So, like, for example, if we look at the current rule set, there was a whole bunch of stuff right at the start of it where they needed to add extra stays on the floor to stiffen up the floors. Now, that was all discussion around the porpoising issue. Now, porpoising as evidenced by what happened on this rule set, is something that is not picked up very well in CFD or tunnel, because if it was,
it wouldn't have happened.
Yeah, exactly. So that's an example where if they have improved some of their porpoising by putting a stay on, then that may have been related to a deflection issue between track and tunnel. You also have a scenario where on track, the car is moving dynamically. It's moving quite quickly between different locations on the ride map, on how it's rolled, on how things are deforming. And just the speed of movement is something where the car on track is going to move much quicker than you can move any car in a wind tunnel model, and certainly in a CFD model where you normally keep the car held still. So that transience of motion will change how the aerodynamics are behaving. It will change whether or not you're getting any transient separations. It will change whether or not vortices are blowing up and then coming back to you. So all of those aspects are stuff that you can't actually resolve in CFD or the tunnel or anything like that. It's all got to be done by track.
Okay. Seeing as you raised the porpoising, I kind of found when those ground effect cars came out in their first preseason test and that became apparent, I think, if my memory is correct, pretty much everyone except for Red Bull was having issues with it, some more than others. I would have thought that would have been apparent in the wind tunnel. So why does something like that, why can't you see that as going to be an issue?
Well, I mean, obviously I wasn't in the teams for this particular scenario, but I certainly can speculate a little bit on this. There's a few reasons why I think you wouldn't pick it up in the wind tunnel. Firstly, as I mentioned, the dynamic speed of the motion would not have been captured. The next one is you have in a wind tunnel, imagine that the ground is moving with respect to the car. It's like a giant treadmill. You can't have the car touching that treadmill, at least certainly not for any long period of time.
So it just basically is going to abrade away the underside of the model.
Yeah, well, the model, it will abrade a bit, but that's honestly not your biggest problem, because the model you can put with somewhat sacrificial parts. The problem is that if you start to destroy your belt, then you're in real trouble. So you don't want to take life out of your belt, because you want really good consistency between your runs. So if you're constantly scratching the belt, all your numbers going to change run to run. So you don't want to be touching the belt, which means that you can never run as low a ride height in the tunnel as you would in real world. So I think that there's a combination of they're not running the real ride heights, they're not running the model moved fast enough, and then it's also like there's a suspension aerodynamic interaction as well. So like obviously if you're exciting a particular resonance mode in the suspension, like you would hope that your lap simulator would pick it up, but if you've never excited it or anything like that, you might not be able to capture that properly. And yeah, of course, there's all structural stuff we were talking about before, where like the flex of a wind tunnel model is not the same as a real car.
Okay, I just coming again from my complete layman's standpoint, I would have thought that they run the model at X ride height. They know how much downforce it's producing. So at a given speed, therefore, they can kind of work out how low the ride height's going to get, and you then sort of run the model to a point where you're starting to stall the underbody, get that separation where the downforce goes away. But obviously that's not the case, and you've just cleared up why that is. So yeah, just nice to get some inside knowledge on why that situation may have actually existed. In terms of how the wind tunnel operates, is there such a thing as a good wind tunnel and a bad wind tunnel, or are these all created equal? And sort of a follow-on question from that, we hear about the models being used for this wind tunnel testing being a scale model, as in they're not a one-to-one full size of the car. Why is that the case, and what is the sort of implications around scaling down a Formula One car for wind tunnel testing?
Yeah, so with respect to good and bad wind tunnels, yes, there's a huge amount of variation in wind tunnels. You can have an absolutely terrible wind tunnel, and it will give you not just strictly the wrong results, but it will give you poor directions. In terms of what makes the difference between a good and a bad wind tunnel, a huge amount of it is flow quality. So imagine that when we have a car running in the real world, the air around it is static and the car drives through it. So we know that we've got a really uniform distribution of the velocity of the air because it's all being driven by the car moving through it. When we have a wind tunnel, we are trying to essentially recreate that by making what the car sees as stationary air and the car's moving through it, except the air's moving. Now, we do that by blowing air in a circuit around the wind tunnel. However, the geometry of the wind tunnel can result in non-uniformities in the flow. So you might have a few percentage variance in velocity across different parts of the wind tunnel. So you can end up with different non-uniformity levels in different wind tunnels. So the quality of the wind tunnel affects that. Then you also have a series of screens and honeycombs that basically control the turbulence level as well as the non-uniformity. And so you can have, on a poor wind tunnel, you'll have you'll have an incorrect level of turbulence in addition to poor non-uniformity, both of which will make the flow field unrepresentative of what's going on at the track. And we're looking for really fine margins at the wind tunnel. So we need those flows to be good.
So is that just another instance of garbage in, garbage out?
Yeah, exactly. But those are just the flow limitations. You've then got instrumentation limitations, which are a huge part of it. So different wind tunnels will have different setups for capturing data that will be resolving data at a different level that will allow you to get different levels of measurement in terms of where you're measuring the flow, how fine you're measuring the flow, but also just the repeatability of things like force balances and stuff like that to make sure that you can resolve very small downforce changes. If you can't resolve a really small change in downforce, it's very hard for you to develop because development is achieved by stacking lots of small downforce gains.
Yeah. You're not sort of getting one knock it out of the ballpark kind of gain. It's hundreds of tiny ones.
Yeah, exactly. Unless you're in concept dev, like when you're doing a really early concept development phase, you might be seeing like 30 points in a wind tunnel session, which is pretty crazy. Whereas later on, you'll be taking like sub-point gains to build on the package of the car. And judging by the situation of where the teams are currently, where you have teams that keep rolling back update packages, like they'll bring an update package and they're not sure if it's worked, and the grid is all coalescing. So all the times are starting to become quite similar. I would guess that a lot of what they're doing now isn't just looking for gains. They're probably getting very, very small gains, but they're probably trying to fix some car characteristics and stuff like that. And that's probably where they're getting a lot of performance from.
So ultimately, it's not always about the outright downforce and drag. It's also to do with the characteristics that the aero package provides to the car. How drivable it is, I guess, and we all hear about the problems of driving the Red Bull, for example.
Yeah. So there's a component of having a good characteristic, like a package with slightly less outright downforce, but a good characteristic will, generally speaking, beat a package with a little bit more downforce and a poor characteristic. But there's the counter to that, which is a package that has poor characteristics but makes a lot more downforce at the poor characteristics. If you can get it to the window where it's running at that peak downforce, it's going to be a faster car.
But then you need the driver with the skill set to actually be able to get it into that window.
Either that, or you need to have a very, very good car setup and ability to set the car up in the right window. And that's certainly something that I've seen in the past can work very, very well, is having a not so brilliant characteristic, but you're able to get the car right on the peak, and that can work really well. Certainly makes the car a lot harder to set up.
Sure. All right, there's a million things that we could dig into here, but I'm aware that I've got a lot of other topics I want to cover today as well, so I don't think we're going to be able to get right down into the nitty-gritty. There are a few more questions we'll go over, though. One of these is, we've talked about the CFD, the wind tunnel, and then obviously real-world track testing, which is where everything comes together and what actually counts. Once a car is on track, what sort of tools do you have to validate how everything's performing? I mean, obviously you've got the stopwatch, which is kind of king at the end of the day, but what data, what sensors have you got on the car to actually validate what you're seeing in the wind tunnel and CFD?
Yep. So a lot of people have probably seen a few of the sensors on cars at test days, but I'll just sort of go through them one at a time. Some of this technology is already existing at even like club level and stuff like that. So obviously you have your most basic sensors, which are like your suspension position and your push rod loads. So just like what is the physical downforce load? That's good for really big stuff. So if you have like a big downforce change, you can work things out from that. But because the suspension moves around a lot in corners and things like that, and when you hit bumps, curbs, etc., it's not the greatest for particularly detecting small changes, particularly if you're trying to affect a mid-corner characteristic or something like that. So we need other tools for that. The tools that people have probably seen is they would have seen these pressure rakes that sit behind cars on test days. They're like a big sort of grid of probes. Those probes can basically measure the flow energy in an area of the car. They're usually made up of what's called a keel probe, or sometimes they're made up of what's called a pitot tube. And they allow you to see whether or not the wake regions on the real car are matching your CFD or your wind tunnel. And it's really common to see these. Ferrari makes some really cool and funky ones that they often put on where all the probes are aligned. There's then another tool, which is called a pressure tap. A pressure tap is basically where you have a small hole at some point on your bodywork and you connect a little hose to it that goes back to a sensor that measures the pressure. And so you'll just have a bunch of those on the car and you can measure how much suction you're generating at any point on the car using the pressure taps. And those are really good because they have very fast response time and they don't tell you any other car characteristics like suspension parameters or anything like that. They just tell you how much suction you're getting. And from that, you can more or less work out how much downforce you're making on the car.
Okay, and I guess with those pressure taps as well, you're able to see those drop out if you start getting flow separation or you stall the underbody?
Yeah, so if you had a pressure tap on the middle of a wing or something like that, and you had a flow separation in the back of the wing, the suction on the pressure tap in the middle of the wing is going to reduce. Well, I should say there'll be less suction. So from that, you can see that something's gone wrong. And you can do that as well if you've got damage. So if like a part of the car's come off or something like that, your pressure taps won't show as much suction, so you'll know you've got an issue.
We quite often will see a driver, run wide on corner exit or something, run the car over a pretty jagged curb, and you sort of see all the sparks fly, and the driver will come over the team radio and say, I've just hit the curb. Can you check for damage? And the team say, yep, we're checking. And the car doesn't actually go into the pit. So am I right in assuming that they are just assessing the input from those pressure taps on the telemetry?
So that's a part of it, but that's not all of it. So one of the things they'll do is they'll also be looking on the live feeds to see what they can see on the cameras as well. So they'll look on the cameras to see what's actually broken.
Sure.
Because occasionally there'll be something where you might actually, let's say, for example, you have a rear winglet and the pressure tap is on the winglet. And let's say you hit a curb violently and the rear winglet detaches. It might not immediately be obvious that you've lost the downforce from that winglet because the pressure tap's gone dark, but you don't know, like pressure taps go dark all the time without anything going wrong. But then you look on the camera and the winglet's just physically missing.
Yeah.
So there is a component of that as well. And in extreme scenarios, you might also check for push rod loads. This is certainly something that's more common if you're working at something like a LMH or anything like that, is that they're not allowed to run P-taps in competition. They can't have the pressure taps in competition. So they have to use push rod loads. So if the driver wants you to check for damage, you have to look at the ride heights and the push rod loads when they're going down the straight to determine if you've lost anything.
Okay. I can imagine the signals from both the ride height sensors and the push rod loads being quite noisy signals. A, am I right there? And B, are you using sort of some math channels to kind of filter out that noise and get useful numbers from those sensors?
Yeah, you're right. They're crazy noisy. They're honestly better than you'd think down the straight. Like when you're actually looking at the straight for any sort of really high-end race car, your springing and damping levels are really, really high. So actually your variation in ride height is not as much as you'd think when you're going down the straight. But yes, you'll generally speaking try to smooth those channels and do an overlay of the previous lap, and that will show you the difference between those channels and you'll see what's going on.
Oh, yeah, I hadn't actually thought about that. That's a pretty clear and obvious solution now that you mention it. But yeah, overlaying pre and post whatever damage occurred is going to tell you the answer.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Now, I actually want to jump back because one of the questions I asked before we kind of skipped across, and that's the scale of the model being used in the wind tunnel. So, yeah, can you sort of fill us in on, A, why aren't we just using one-to-one scale models? And then B, how does the scale of the model kind of affect the results you're seeing?
Yeah, so why aren't we using models currently that are full scale? Well, there's a few things. Firstly, it should be noted that most F1 wind tunnels can actually fit a full scale car and have fit full scale cars in the past. Back in the day, they used to test full scale. The FIA mandates these days that you can't test full scale. You can only test at, I think it's 60% is the current percentage. And there's a few reasons for that. The main driving one is cost. Swapping out parts on a full scale car is quite expensive, and the smaller you make that, the cheaper it is. Now, it's worth noting that when you go to a 60% scale model, it's 60% in each linear dimension. So the volume is significantly less than 60%. When you stand next to a 60% model, the thing looks tiny. Like if I had to eyeball guess, I'd say it's 30%, but it is 60%. And so as a result, the costs of manufacturing parts are significantly lower. The loads are significantly lower on the model, which means that it's easier for you to move it around, easier for you to get your force balances set up. You can use 3D printed parts without them breaking, whereas on a full-size model, the aerodynamic loads can be quite high, and you probably will need to resort in most places to full carbon parts. It's generally just much more expensive to run a full-size model. And it also has requirements on the wind tunnel in terms of you have something called blockage ratio, which is basically the ratio of the frontal area of the car versus the area of your wind tunnel test section. And as you get to higher blockage ratios, the walls and roof of the wind tunnel start to have more of an effect on the downforce that the car is making, because it's essentially driving through a tunnel.
Yeah, sure.
So you'll need to do some fancy stuff to try and make the walls and roof of the tunnel not have as much as an effect. So you could say have those walls move, or you can have them slotted, or things like that. There's a few different ways you can play it, but you just need to do more stuff to make a larger model work than a smaller model work. So generally speaking, a small model is preferred because it's the most economical way to do accurate development.
That makes perfect sense. I had assumed it was more around the limitations of the wind tunnel. You've mentioned some of those, but obviously that's not the main driving factor. I guess the follow on from this then is, does everything in terms of what you learn in the wind tunnel on a 60% model scale nicely to full scale?
Yeah, so you're getting at a good point, which is it's not perfect. There's this thing called Reynolds number, which is basically it's a characteristic number based on length of an object that you're blowing air over, as well as a few other different parameters. But the main thing that's important to us here is the length of the object. And if you have a 60% model, your Reynolds number is only 60% of the full size thing. Now, the significance of this is that your flow behaves differently at different Reynolds numbers. It's not quite exactly the same. Things like separation points will move, vortex intensities and strengths will change at different Reynolds numbers. It's not a perfect correlation. You can correct Reynolds numbers by increasing the speed. So if I have a smaller model, I can increase my wind speed to get the same Reynolds number. But that has its own set of problems, which is that if you go too fast with air, you start to get into this thing called compressibility, where basically if I blow air over my model at, say, 500 kilometers per hour, the air is going to be moving fast enough that now it will start to change density significantly, and that will cause the aerodynamics to be different again. So you're kind of trading between Reynolds number or compressibility effects.
And you don't actually run into those compressibility effects at normal race car speeds, correct?
Not significantly in cornering and stuff like that. End of straight speeds, you're getting there, but in most cornering scenarios, you're not there. And again, it's the sort of thing where the effect is so slight at the speeds that we're running at that it's not really something that we need to consider in any great depth. So yeah, we do have to be careful about accidentally introducing compressibility in the tunnel. The other thing too is that the FIA mandates a maximum tunnel speed now.
Oh, okay.
So you can't just run the tunnel at 500 k's an hour. They mandate the maximum at I believe it's 50 meters a second currently, which is 180 k's an hour.
Okay. Seeing as you just mentioned the FIA, I've got another question that's always sort of been in the back of my mind. We know that the teams are limited as to how much wind tunnel testing they're allowed per season. A lot of these teams have their own on-site wind tunnels. So what's to stop them chucking the car and a team in the wind tunnel at 3 o'clock in the morning and just doing some sneaky testing?
Well, there's a few things around that. I suppose I should probably first sort of elaborate a bit more on what the rules are, or were, I should say.
Yeah, please do.
So you have basically wind tunnel testing and CFD testing are both regulated by the FIA. They give you allocations for both. So you have in the wind tunnel, you're allowed a certain number of runs. So that's like you put an option on the car, you do a run, that's your run. So you're allowed a certain number of runs. You're allowed a certain amount of occupancy, which is time spent working in the tunnel. So your occupancy starts when you do your first run of the day and ends at the end of your last run of the day. So you can't just be running 24/7 nonstop because of the occupancy. And then you have a certain amount of tunnel time, which is actually time spent with the fan on. Now, this is where it links into the CFD, where CFD, you have this unit called a MAU. It's a MAUH. And it's basically a metric they use to work out a certain amount of computing power that's used for a CFD run. And you're allowed a certain amount of MAU. However, you can use less MAU to get more wind tunnel time with the fan on. Or you can if you use less fan on time, you're allowed to use more CFD hours. Now, in the new or current rule set, they also have a limit on how many geometries you can put through CFD. But back when I was doing it, that limit didn't exist. So you could do as many geometries as you want in CFD, so long as you were within a certain computational bound in terms of your max computations, and then you had your fan time in the tunnel. Now, there's obviously a bit of complexity with how you balance all this, how everything's running. And so, like you say, what's to stop someone just going off and just sending it and deciding they're just going to do a bunch of runs with no one noticing? Well, you have an FIA camera in the tunnel.
Aha.
And basically, every time the wind speed in the tunnel goes above a certain level, that camera takes a photo of the car or the model in the tunnel. Every time the wind speed goes below, it takes another photo. So those photos will go and basically document how much fan time has been on, like basically when the tunnel's been running. So that's your fan time. It gives you your occupancy by first photo of the day and last photo of the day. And also they can look at that photo and see whether or not you changed the car during it, because you're only meant to have one geometry per run. I think you can change wing flap angle, like as if you would on the track, but everything else is like you're not meant to be changing parts on the car in the middle of a run. So they will be looking at that to see if there's a difference between the start of the run and the end of the run, because that would be illegal.
Okay. All right, so they're basically spying on the teams. Makes perfect sense. That all raises one more question for me, though, around the CFD side of things. I can understand that wind tunnels are expensive, and hence I can only assume that wind tunnel time is also horrendously expensive. And this is all about trying to cut costs for, I guess, the teams that aren't infinitely funded. On the other hand, I would have assumed that the costs involved in running CFD tests would not be too extreme. So is the limitation on how much CFD you're doing more in line with stopping the better funded teams just throwing huge financial resources at the smartest people and running indefinite tests to get the best results? Or am I off the mark there?
Oh, I think there's quite a bit of complexity as to the motives there, because the reality is, like, compute these days is pretty cheap in the scheme of things. Like you could definitely, I think the rules are very restrictive these days, particularly the newer rules that limit number of geometries. They are far more restrictive than any measure to cut costs. It, to me, is not a cost-cutting measure. I think it's more of a sporting measure to try and slow the rate of development. And particularly certain teams used to leverage running a lot of geometries more than others. Some teams didn't leverage that as hard. And so I think that it's tried to pull that more into line. But it's like, I don't think it's at all financial. And the reality is that obviously I can't disclose specifics, but I have seen the financial numbers for how much it costs to run an aero department, and it's way less than what you think.
Okay.
So I don't think that aero restrictions actually have that much to do with a cost-saving measure. I think that deploying a lot of fresh aero updates to the car is a different story, because that is obviously a very expensive exercise. But I think they could say you all get free for all on CFD tomorrow as long as you're within the overall budget cap on the team. And I don't think that we'd see any big cost increases or anything like that. I think it would all be pretty measured. You just get a lot more CFD development.
Yeah, okay. So much more dramatic development of the car, but not necessarily affecting the bottom line so much.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. All right. One more sort of topic that we always hear discussed, and we've sort of touched on it to a degree already, is the sensitivity of the aero to ride height, particularly with these ground effect cars with the underbodies being so critical. I'm just wondering, so people like myself can kind of maybe start to get a feel for this, if it's possible for you to give us kind of a ballpark in terms of, if we raise the ride height of the car a certain amount, let's say 5 millimeters, which for a typical road going car is tiny, you're not even going to notice that. Is it possible for you to give me a sense of what that might do to the downforce as a percentage? Like, how much would we lose? Are we talking sort of 5 to 10%, or are we talking sort of significant sort of 20 or 30% over such a small ride height change?
Oh, it's so variable depending on car to car. You can have some cars that are incredibly ride height sensitive, that, a couple of mil can mean, like let's say you have an extreme ride height sensitive car with like a very high extraction diffuser that relies on some form of sealing mechanism along the sides of the skirts. 3 to 5 millimeters might be, like 30% of your downforce. That's a very extreme scenario. You can have other cars where you can shift the rear ride height through like 40 millimeters and you'll see barely any change. So it's so car specific.
So nothing set in stone there.
No, it's so car specific.
Okay. All right. I think we'll move on before we sort of run out of time here. How long were you in Formula One, and sort of how did your exit from Formula One sort of happen?
Yeah, so in the scheme of things, I wasn't in for that long. I was in for approximately 3 years. In terms of how the exit happened, I think it was one of those things where, whilst the job in Formula One was really cool, I did not enjoy the lifestyle of living over there. Coming from a place like Australia, where it's, warm, obviously, but also like, if you want to go to the beach, you can. If you want to go to a restaurant in Sydney, like, you can. When you go to like countryside England, and most of the F1 teams are kind of in the middle of nowhere in England, there's just not that much stuff around there.
Not many white sand beaches?
No, not a whole lot. I tried swimming at Cornwall in winter one time, and that was pretty cold. But
I understand the UK is probably not renowned for its weather, particularly over the winter months as well.
Yeah, no, the winters were not enjoyable. But yeah, it just, I didn't like living there. My wife did not like living there at all, even worse than me. And so it was always going to be a bit of a temporary thing. There was only so long we could sustain it. And also, like, just financially, it wasn't brilliant for us. So we wanted to come back. And the obvious thing to do was to basically make sure that I got what I felt like was as much knowledge and learning and everything that I could out of F1, and felt like I got a really experience and gave it a red hot go. And then once I'd done that, I basically handed in my notice and came back to Australia. And that brought us back here. And I basically returned back to some of the stuff I was doing before I went over, which was doing a lot of motorsport consulting work.
Okay. I can only assume that having ex-Mercedes F1 aerodynamicist on your CV probably doesn't hurt your chances of getting consulting work.
Yeah, no, it's pretty good. It's pretty good. I think it's one of those things where, certainly for when I was doing like club level consulting and stuff like that, it obviously gives you a lot of, I guess, respect that people kind of trust your work or implicitly already. And then for professional level consulting, what happened was I was getting a lot of word of mouth referrals, where professional teams would call up some of their contacts at Mercedes and be like, "Do you know anyone who's no longer in F1 that can still do this job for me?" And they would recommend me. And so then that's how I got most of my professional level contracts, was actually a word of mouth recommendations.
Okay. Maybe could you just walk us through, we don't need to get into the names or the specifics of the job, but maybe what a typical, if that's even a term, what a typical consulting gig for, a high-end, well-funded race team might involve?
Yeah, so most of what I do with race teams these days is that a lot of the teams outside of F1 level, the development team that designs the car and the team that races the car at the track are usually very divorced. They're usually not at all the same team. So if I'm working with the track team, what I'll be doing is I'll be looking at the track data, looking at the characteristics of the car provided by the development team, and looking really at how to best set up the track car. And that will involve obviously providing guidance for the race team, or as has been the case certainly a lot last year, going out to race events myself and assisting with the setup of the car, as well as the monitoring of the car during races. So doing things like, looking for damage, like we were discussing earlier, but also just helping with aerodynamic setup, suspension setup as well, because suspension setup on aero cars these days is as much an aerodynamicist's job as a race engineer's job, because it's all about getting the car into the right aero window. So just a combination of those things.
Okay. You also mentioned consulting work for club level races. Again, maybe give us a typical sort of outline of what one of those jobs may look like.
Yeah, so club level race stuff is really heavily development focused. I do track visits and track work on some of those, but really working on building up the aerodynamic packages on club level cars. A lot of club level guys do actually really see the value in aero these days, particularly aero at a high level. And it's really cool to see how much some of the guys want to get into it.
I think that's probably come of age. I can't say we could necessarily blame all of it squarely on World Time Attack, but I mean, I think definitely in the Southern Hemisphere, what we've seen with World Time Attack over the 14, 12 years that I've been attending, obviously in the early days, the aero was very basic, very limited compared to what we see now. And you can't help but notice how fast the cars are these days. I think coupled with, in the early days, it was probably a struggle for the likes of a Mitsubishi Evo to reliably make more than 600 or 700 horsepower. Now north of 1,000 is not unheard of. So back then, the cars probably weren't as traction limited as they are now. And you sort of get to this pointy end where when you're at 1,000 horsepower, adding another 100 horsepower isn't actually going to have a significant impact on your lap time. So you need to look at the low-hanging fruit of where can we do that. And obviously aero becomes that low-hanging fruit. And then obviously the club racers that have much less powerful cars see what happens at that level and think, well, I'll have some of that.
Yeah, I think that's definitely a factor. I think it's one of those things too, though, where like if I went back with my current knowledge that I've acquired and my current computing setup that I've got, and I went back to 2010 and started designing cars for World Time Attack Challenge or something like that, even with their power levels, like you would go and absolutely wipe the floor.
Oh, yeah. No doubt.
The cars would be so much faster than anything else out. And I think that some of that's come from, we've obviously gotten more involvement of professional aerodynamicists coming in and helping stuff. You also, CFD is more affordable to get good computing power than ever. Like the sort of compute setup that I would pay $30,000 per node for right now, back then would have cost hundreds of thousands of dollars per node.
So everything just becomes more accessible.
Yeah, exactly. So I think that's really good. And I think also like there's just much more material online these days for club level people. That there's more that even like people that are starting out, they can learn more and more from what's available online and apply a lot of that. Whereas I feel like 10 years ago, it was very hard to find. much information.
Yeah, I agree. I think that goes across the board, and realistically is one of the reasons why HPA exists. And it's a very nice segue into the next section of this interview, which is, of course, the Aero course that you've produced for HPA. Before I just dive into that, though, just one more thing I wanted to add, which I think is also, it's almost a recalibration of expectations. And what I mean by that is, when you've got a race car and it's making 400 horsepower or something like that, you go and add 100 horsepower to it, you're going to notice that it's fun, it's exciting, the car's going to be a rocket ship in a straight line. So I think for the longest time, that was the natural direction people would gravitate to, is let's add power to go faster. But of course, as I mentioned before, that sort of comes to a sort of a, iteratively you're getting smaller and smaller gains the more power you add. Whereas on face value, you add aero, probably the car's actually going to be slower at the end of a straight, which isn't sort of super exciting. But the fact that you might be able to then take turn 1 25 kilometers an hour faster, definitely once you tip into the corner and you realize how much grip you've got, you're going to notice that. But I think it's the recalibration of expectations that's important for people to see the real benefit in aero. Do you sort of agree with that?
Yeah, I think that aero is a really interesting one in terms of driver feedback, because like power, obviously, you get on the throttle, you get on a straight, you're going to hit the throttle to 100%. Like that's what you're going to do, and you're going to feel any power increase as a result of that. Aero, if you go and drive the car in exactly the same manner as you were driving without the aero, the car is, like you say, it's going to be slower down the straight and it's going to be the same speed everywhere else. You're not going to be at the limit of grip, but like it's not going to feel any faster. But then when someone then goes and spends more time with it, they can realize that the aero gives them more grip and actually adjust their braking points and adjust their corner entry speeds to suit that. That's when they really start to notice it. And unfortunately, a lot of drivers, particularly at the amateur level, they don't realize that straight away, and they have to sort of work their way up there. Normally, the first bit of feedback I get from drivers that have just taken an aero upgrade kit from me is that they always make a lot of comments about the braking, because I think it's the easiest thing for them to relate to, whereby they can just mash the pedal 100% and realize, hey, the brakes aren't locking up, but I'm pulling some serious G.
Particularly if you've got proper motorsport ABS, it's not a lot of driver skill. Mash the pedal as hard as you can and you'll quickly figure out what the aero's doing for you.
Yeah, exactly. And so I think that's where they can really relate. But then like the cornering things, they all have to work. If they're not already a professional driver, they have to work their way up to it.
Yeah, I mean, I went through exactly that learning curve with our 8.6 endurance car, and I mean, I'm by no stretch of the imagination a professional driver, and it took probably several trips to the track, if I'm honest, to sort of slowly chip away at the capabilities of the car with the aero on it and relearn what the car was capable of doing around certain corners on a racetrack that I knew really well. Having said that, it's probably also the sensible way of building up slowly rather than sort of going out 10 tenths or 11 tenths and sort of coming unstuck on your first lap too.
Yeah, 100%. And the thing is too, it's terrifying to throw an aero car into a fast corner for the first time at high speed, because you're like, this isn't going to make it.
Yeah, it really is exactly that. You've got to kind of retrain your brain as to what the car is capable of, because everything is telling you should have been braking 50 meters earlier and been scrubbing an extra 20 kilometers an hour off before you tipped into the corner, but the car just goes around.
Yeah.
And then on the next lap, you're like, well, it did it that time, so let's push it a little further.
And then you run out of tire and then you're in trouble.
Yeah. I mean, there's always a limit somewhere. It's just the limits. When you come unstuck, you're going a lot faster. All right, so let's jump into club level aerodynamics, which is the new course that we've collabed on. And I mean, we've just come off a fairly high level discussion of aerodynamics at a Formula 1 level. And I'm sure a lot of club level guys that so far haven't dabbled with anything maybe sort of more advanced than a generic eBay rear wing on their club level race car are probably thinking this is all beyond them. Maybe you need to be a mathematician, maybe you need a PhD like you do, Kyle. Give us the actual truth.
Yes.
What does a club level guy need to know?
Yeah, I think it's one of those things where like you don't need to have, like you were saying, like intense mathematical knowledge or a PhD to to add a lot of performance to your car, right? There's a lot of sort of first level simple things you can do around the front splitter, around the floor, around the rear wing, that can improve your performance by really quite a lot. It's obviously never going to be at the level of a custom professional aerodynamics kit, but it's going to get you a huge step up from having a car with no aero at all.
I guess in the sort of a bit of the old 80-20 rule comes into play here as well, and developing something not necessarily with a professional aerodynamicist without the benefit of CFD, you're still going to probably be able to get a fair chunk of the results. And then that next step up, CFD, a professionally developed kit, is going to give you another gain again, but maybe not sort of doubling your performance, if I'm sort of explaining that even remotely well.
Yeah, 100%. You can get a really long way with the club level thing. It's very hard to specify percentages because then even within professional aerodynamicists, there's a big variance between the different professional aerodynamicists. So it's not so clear cut, but yeah, you can get a long way with just some good best practices knowledge.
Yeah. Within the course, we've got a section where you cover aerodynamics fundamentals, and some of this goes pretty deep, and there is a bit of math. I'm not going to lie. We're talking about what a fluid actually is. You're talking about Bernoulli's equation, viscosity, Reynolds numbers, speed effects, boundary layers, etc. And as I mentioned, there's some math involved here. Am I safe to sort of explain this, though, that this is background theory, which will help the viewer understand how and why an aerodynamic device functions, but we don't actually need to be breaking out the calculator in order to do a club level aero package?
Yeah, from my perspective, it's one of those things where I find that knowing the fundamentals of how something works can help you sort of understand when it is working, how it's working. So I think it is useful background knowledge. But yeah, it's one of those things that, like, when you're doing a club level aero kit, it's not like you're going to be getting a downforce calculation done at track, that you're going to be like rushing out the calculator to get it all done and adjusting angles and stuff there. Like it's more just so that you understand, like, oh, why is this doing that? Why is the flow separating here or not? And getting that sort of knowledge.
I'd like in this section, I think we've tried to do this really with all of our courses. There's probably more background fundamental knowledge in our courses than anyone actually needs to do the particular task, whether that's motorsport wiring, engine building, or tuning. And I liken this to our EFI tuning fundamentals course. Got a section there which essentially follows what the internal calculations are going on inside of the ECU to actually end up getting from a volumetric efficiency number through to an injector pulse width. Now, I've never done that calculation even one time when I'm on the dyno. So is it absolutely necessary in order to be able to tune a car? Well, no, but I think it makes you a more well-rounded tuner when you actually have that full comprehension of what's going on inside of the ECU, that sort of the calculation path that's going on. And just as importantly with the EFI tuning, it helps when things aren't going right to sort of understand where the disconnect is actually potentially going on. Now, coming back to aero at a club level, so we're not talking here about the need to go and have our car 3D scanned and then run through CFD, are we? We're sort of talking more about purchasing a generic off-the-shelf front splitter, for example, a generic rear wing, but also understanding how those parts work, how they integrate, and then how to choose the parts that are going to give you a well-balanced aero package for your application.
Yeah, so like you mentioned, a lot of it is about, like, when you go to buy an aerodynamic component, there can be a lot of data given on those components and things like that. There's a lot of stuff on the market, and it can be quite difficult to choose what's good. And so if you understand what is required from an aerodynamic component and what's good and what's bad, you can filter out all the components that you don't want and find the ones that you do. So there's definitely an aspect in buying the correct parts for your build rather than getting a part that might not be good, because there's plenty of stuff on the market that is not very good, and then there's obviously plenty of stuff on the market that is very good. So it's important to have that knowledge to know. There's also obviously some guides in terms of if you were to DIY stuff, like let's say you want to do a plywood splitter and go through and form your own front diffuser tunnels and stuff like that. There's some guides in there on basically like what are some good angles to start with? What's some good ride heights that you should be setting this up with? Things like that, that if you want to start at the base level, at the lower budget build stuff, you can use that as a guide that will get you in the ballpark to start with, so that you're not floundering around at the track with a part that's nowhere.
You sort of want to get the parts so they're sort of 80% right and 20% not wrong. I think I stole that term from Murray Coots from MCA, but I think that probably applies here.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay. Now, with the sort of cars that we run at club level, it's fair to say, I think, that getting downforce at the front is really problematic. You know, there's levels to this stuff in terms of efficiency of the wing, but as I mentioned earlier, we can put a big wing on the back of a car and get rear downforce. It's the front that's sort of more problematic, and then it's about balancing that out. So can you give us sort of a rough idea of, you've mentioned the splitter and these tunnels, how does that all integrate at the front of the car, and what's the sort of method by which that splitter works to create downforce?
Yeah, so the front splitter at a club level is not a super complex device. We're putting an extension out the front of the front bumper. We're going to capture some of the high pressure that is caused by the existence of the front of the car on top of it, and then we're going to generate suction underneath that component. Now, most of the downforce we want to get from the suction underneath, because we can leverage it a little bit harder than the pressure. And so what we're doing is that we're basically turning it into sort of a mini front wing, if you will, by putting little diffusers in it that diffuse the air into the sort of wheel arch space. This is the main way in which we get downforce at the club level on the front end. And like you said, getting downforce at the front end on a club level car is one of the more difficult things to do. Particularly if you have a higher ride height rule, you really will be struggling to get that front downforce. Whereas rear downforce is very easy. I can go over to Sydney Composites, buy myself a Brackley rear wing, a big size one, and crank it, and I've got all the rear downforce in the world. Whereas with the front splitter, you will struggle a little bit more to get enough front downforce to cover things off, unless your rules allow you to have a huge front splitter, but that comes with its own set of problems, where if you go too big on your front splitter, you'll end up with some ride height and pitch sensitivity issues, because obviously the front is very affected by ride height compared to the rear, where a rear wing is really not that affected by it.
Yeah, that makes sense. I guess it's worth also mentioning here the practicality of these big front splitters that extend, maybe 2 feet outside on the car on each side. Perfect for world time attack if it fits within the rules, but maybe less useful in club racing, where you're actually door to door, and someone's probably going to snap the end off your front splitter in the first lap.
Yeah, any sort of wheel-to-wheel racing, you obviously have to be very mindful of the overall width of the car and overhangs and things like that. So you'll often have to compromise on outright downforce to just get something that, isn't going to be constantly smashing other cars.
Yeah. There's it's pretty useless if you're going to have to be replacing it after every session. You just touched briefly on ride height, and if your ride height rules enforce a ride height where that front splitter is not going to be effective. I mean, I guess there's no black and white here, but what could you give us a range of sort of ride heights that we should be targeting if we want a club level front splitter to be somewhat effective?
Yeah, I mean, usually my ballpark numbers that I give is just sit the thing around about 70 millimeters off the ground. If you had no rules on it, is probably a good place to be. If you go lower than that, you start to get into a lot of ride height sensitivity. Like if you are 50 millimeters, you need to have a very stiff front end to make that work. If you go higher than that, if you're 80 millimeters plus, you generally speaking, it's harder to make front downforce. So somewhere around that's usually a good place to sit. And then beyond that, like there'll be slight specifics dictated by the splitter itself that will decide where you want to go beyond that point.
Okay. With the sort of downforce levels that we could expect to get at this club level with these generic components, do we need to be starting to think about increasing our spring rates to cope with the downforce at high speeds, or bump rubbers and packers, or are we nowhere near that level with this sort of a package?
No, we're definitely approaching that level. You would need to almost certainly stiffen the spring rates at a minimum. If you slap a front splitter with front diffusers and a rear wing on a car and try to leave it at the spring rates you were running with no aero, you're going to be nowhere. The car's going to be way too soft.
Okay. All right. I think that gives a pretty good gut feel of how effective this is going to be. If we have to start changing spring rates, it's doing something.
Yeah. That's the thing. And like, it is the sort of thing where, like, you're still going to be adding like a couple of 100 kilos on the car. So it's like, if you consider how much your springs would compress if you were to, say, stand a person on your front splitter, like, it's not insignificant what you're going to be adding.
Yeah. Coming back as well to those tunnels on the front splitter, and I mean, if people aren't able to kind of visualize what we're talking about here, a quick Google of front splitter tunnels is probably going to give you an indication of what we are going on about here. Those are going to vent, as you mentioned, into the front wheel wells. Now, I'm guessing here, in order for these to be as effective as they can, we want those to be venting into a low pressure area. So on that basis, quite critical how we remove air out of those front wheel wells as well.
Yeah, so you've got to let the front splitter breathe, right? Like, that air that you diffuse out into the wheel wells has to go somewhere. So you can either let it go back under the car, which is not the best air path necessarily. So if the air's going back under the car, obviously you've got the blockage at the rear of the rear wheel well, and also you don't know quite how that air is going to get re-ingested by the floor. Or you can try and kick it out the side or out the top of the wheel well. So that's where things like the louvers or vents on the top of the wheel arch come into play, or you can cut away the rear of the arch, which is usually my preferred approach in there. And that can help get some of that air out from the front tunnels. And when you do that, you generally just see the front splitter start to light up a little bit.
Okay. The other component, and again, I don't want to sort of go too much deeper on this. I've got some more topics to cover. The other components that we sort of would often consider as a flat floor and a rear diffuser, even at this club level. Am I right in saying that if you are allowing the air from that wheel well to be re-ingested under the car, that could have some negative impacts on the effectiveness of the underfloor and the rear diffuser?
It depends. It's all about the geometry of your floor. The air from the front diffuser can be quite clean. So if you have a good floor geometry, when you ingest it back under, you'll be okay. It can be quite positive, in fact. But that's not always the case. So if you don't have a good floor geometry, you don't quite know what it's going to do. And even if you are to vent the front wheel arch like we discussed, there'll still be a degree of that air ingested under the floor. There's no way to really get around from that. So a lot of it comes down to having a good floor geometry, having everything nicely sealed up, and just making sure that you get as clean an airflow as possible through the floor. And then the advantage of the flat floor is obviously that you can get really clean airflow back to the rear diffuser. And that's what allows the rear diffuser to get its performance.
Okay. There's some complexities that come along with that, of course, with front engine cars in terms of heat management with the exhaust system and now what could be essentially a sealed transmission tunnel, but probably topics for another day. What I wanted to move on to is validation methods at the club level, where we probably almost certainly don't have either budget for or knowledge about how to decipher the results of something like an aero rake, which we talked about in F1. We're definitely not going to have access to pressure taps. Can you give us a sort of a rundown on what techniques are viable at the club level for validating how our components are working?
Yeah, so you got a few choices. You can run something like a wool tough test if you're trying to look for separations or something like that, or trying to look for a rear wing adjustment. So you just tape a bunch of little short bits of wool onto a wing, say, and see which direction they're pointing, see if you've got any flow separations in that way. And that's a very simple and effective test that you can do. Another one is coast down testing. That one is basically you take the car up to speed, kick it into neutral or clutch it in, and you basically see how long it takes the car to slow down. That can tell you what the car's drag level is. So that's quite a handy one to have up your sleeve. And then some club level guys still have suspension potentiometers, so like little ride height sensors on the suspension, and you can reverse calculate what downforce you're making from those. So those are probably the three main methods that club guys tend to use for working out aero characteristics of the car.
Okay, I just want to dive really briefly into each of those. So the wall tough tests, I think probably most people could understand that or have probably seen an application of that. I think most people would probably think that the technique is maybe not that advanced because you're dealing literally with tufts of wool and some sellotape, but actually can give you genuinely useful data.
Yeah, well, I mean, a great example of this is that, like, if you actually go back and have a look at like a lot of like NASA aircraft testing at high angle maneuverability and stuff like that, if you look at the photos from it, they're using wool tufts. Like they've got a second plane flying alongside, taking photos with a tele lens of like a fighter jet with wool tufts all over the damn thing.
Okay, if it's good enough for NASA, it's good enough for us.
Yeah, exactly. So
and the reality of this is that the testing that we did for some B-roll as part of this course, we actually proved that we were getting separation at the outside edge of the rear wing on our 8.6, which we wouldn't have known any other way.
Yeah, exactly. So like you can pick up a lot with it. And like, yes, the tufts slightly disturb the surface flows, but they're still showing you what's going on. And they're really handy because they're transient. So like when you have a camera on it and you're recording a video of it, you can see what happens in a corner versus a straight. So like, let's say we have an end plate separation on a wing. That might only happen in a corner. And so we can shove a GoPro looking at that and then see the tufts move and point forwards in the middle of a corner and then straighten up when you hit the straight. So that's actually quite a powerful thing to have up your sleeve.
I guess it's probably way too late in the piece, but we've been using this term through the entirety of this chat so far of separation. Could you maybe just give us a bit of insight into what that means? It's essentially the race car equivalent of aerodynamic stall in an aircraft?
Yeah, so stall is essentially a subcategory, I guess, of separation, where what happens is that flow normally follows surfaces at low angles of attack and low curvatures. The airflow will sort of curve around the surface. But if the curvature is too extreme or the angle of attack of something like a wing is too extreme, the flow will peel away from the surface. It won't stay attached to the surface. And this is what we call separation. Now, in an aircraft, you would know it as stall because what happens is you get a flow separation either from the leading edge or the trailing edge of the wing. And when that happens, because the air isn't curving around the wing as hard anymore, the wing generates less, in the case of an aircraft, less lift. And that means that the aircraft with less lift will start to drop. So anyone who's flown an aircraft would know you come to the point of stall, it sort of stalls, and then it kind of does a little bit of a drop, and then it recovers once the aircraft loses its angle of attack and goes a bit faster.
One thing I would just add to that as well, I think it's a misconception, actually a misconception I suffered from when I was learning how to fly, is that a stall in an aircraft is related to speed, but it's not. It's angle of attack, and a fighter jet could be stalled at very high air speeds if the angle of attack is still excessive.
Oh yeah, exactly. And I think some of that comes from the whole nature of aircraft with the stall speed, where obviously like the stall speed on an aircraft is dictated because you need enough lift to keep the aircraft up in the sky, which means that as you go slower and slower, you need to increase the angle of attack of the wing more and more by going nose up with the aircraft. And what that's doing is it's increasing the angle of attack of the wing and getting close to the stall point of the wing. If you go faster, you need less angle of attack to make the same amount of lift. So therefore, you can be further away from the stall point. And so, yeah, on a race car, we don't change the angles of attack of different items. Like it doesn't matter whether you're going 100 k's an hour, 200, 300. The wing's always at roughly the same angle of attack. So there is no quote unquote stall speed for a race car. It really, an aircraft stall speed is just a stall angle that it happens to reach at that speed. And obviously there's some slight Reynolds number effects. But yeah, stall is not a mega speed sensitive effect. It's an angle sensitive effect with a teeny bit of speed sensitivity in it.
So essentially we're going to get separation on a rear wing on a race car if we put too much angle of attack on it. It's just not, it's going to separate on the underside of the wing.
Yeah, that is 100% the gist.
Okay. And when that happens, just like the aircraft, unlike the aircraft where we lose lift, we lose downforce.
Yeah, exactly. We lose downforce and we also pick up drag too. So
okay, cool. All right, we've got that out of the way. Now, The coast down test you talked about there for sort of calculating the drag. I mean, obviously there's a lot of other stuff going on there with sort of the drivetrain, etc. But we can kind of take that out of the equation because that's going to be a constant regardless of our test. So we could put a wing on, we could take a wing off, we could change the angle of attack of the wing, and if we repeat that test, we're looking at just the difference. That's kind of the gist of what you're saying.
Yeah, so with the coast down tests, like the absolute numbers are like, they're all right, but they're not perfect. But yeah, you can do back-to-back testing where you can change wing angle of attack and see what's happening with the drag force, and that can help you with setting up the car because you can characterize how much drag your car makes at different wing angles. Or you can add different parts on the car, and you can cross-correlate it with, if you've got other tests to get the downforce of the car, you can cross-correlate the drag versus the downforce and get an idea for what your efficiencies sit at. And you can use that to better inform your component selection and your car setup aerodynamically when you're at track, which can be quite helpful.
Okay, and the last method you mentioned there was the use of shock pots, ride height sensors, and as you mentioned, these have got to a point where they're somewhat affordable, so they're not unusual to see at the club level. And again, I'll refer to some of my previous point where the data from these in a straight line even is still quite noisy. So how best to get useful data from them?
Yeah, so it's a bit like how we were talking about with the damage monitoring with the car, in terms of if we stick to measuring on the straights and we do enough smoothing and we do comparisons between different components, we can use that to work out roughly what downforce we're making. Generally speaking, I've found that just doing absolute numbers on shock pots never quite works because you try to calculate it using your spring rates. Obviously, you're trying to stay off your bump rubbers for this test, which can be a bit tricky when you're relegating the test to the straights. But the absolute values I found don't usually line up that well to what, say, the strain gauges on a car might output or anything like that. But if you go and say, do a run with shock pots, change your rear wing angle, do the run again, like you generally speaking will see that pretty clearly, that you're losing or gaining downforce in the rear. And you can look at the displacement, make sure you're not on the bump rubbers and see what the compression was, the suspension between the two options. And then you can work out roughly what your downforce change was from your change.
Okay, I mean that all sounds relatively achievable. One thing I wanted to bring in here, I mean, most people who watch Formula One will see in some of the practice sessions the teams putting flow-vis paint on the car and then sending it out and sort of inspecting the car when it comes back in. I think those who maybe haven't been too involved, like myself, would think that that might be a relatively useful tool for the club level guy or girl, given that flow-vis seemingly doesn't cost the earth to buy or even make. And I know you're definitely not an advocate of doing that. So for those thinking of rushing out and doing something similar, why is that not a viable technique at club level?
So the thing with flow-vis is that it is an extremely useful technique for those who know how to use it. And it's also a technique that is very much open to misinterpretation or incorrect application. So it's one of those things where, like, I obviously use flow-vis fairly heavily. I prep it, I spray it on cars at the track, and then I can get the results I need. But things like being slightly off with your recipe can cause the patterns to not be quite correct. Other things like, just because a pattern exists on the car doesn't mean that you can interpret it correctly. Sometimes they're not always clean cut. Like finding the separation point of a wing is usually relatively clean cut with flow-vis, but like there's certainly patterns that I've seen on an end plate where it's taken me a good 5 minutes to work out what's actually happening on the front wing end plate.
Right. So we've got no chance.
yeah. It's one of those things where you see some stuff in flow-vis that's pretty crazy. And yeah, most of the times that I see just club level guys try to do flow-vis online, I look at the findings and conclusions they drew from the results, and I'm like, you did not understand what actually happened here.
Yeah, I mean, I think that's probably to be expected for those who aren't as deep in the world of aerodynamics as you are, but good to know that that's probably not the first tool we should be reaching for. On that note around separation, I mean, even without flow-vis, I've run our car at the racetrack on a wet day, and you sort of end up with, once everything's dried off back in the workshop, you sort of end up almost with, I guess, a flow-vis effect on the wing, where you've got the sort of the dirty water is dried and you can kind of see separation even with that, I've found.
Yeah, there is some trickiness to that one though, whereby I agree that I've seen that effect plenty of times and it looks pretty cool, but the nature of water and the way in which it beads and the way its surface tension holds along surfaces can be misleading with respect to the water droplets carry a lot of inertia because they're big droplets and not a film. And so what happens is that they'll actually carry on through a region of separation before detaching.
So they won't show separation where it's actually separating.
Yeah, they'll usually push your separation line back a little bit from where it really is. In other cases, you can have the opposite, where you've got a really curved surface that still has aerodynamic attachment. Sometimes the curvature is too much for the droplet and the droplet will still come off. So you can get it either way.
Okay. Not a useful tool. Don't run your car in the rain and try and draw too many conclusions from that.
No, just look at it and think it's pretty.
All right, Kyle, I think we've probably taken up enough of your time, so we'll move towards wrapping this thing up. And of course, we've got the same three questions we ask all of our guests at the end. The first of those is, what's next in the future for you?
Yeah, so for me, there's some really exciting stuff that's coming out, should be coming out at this year's World Time Attack that I've been working on. So I'm really looking forward to releasing that to the public because it's going to be sick. So that's going to be really cool. I'm also working on some really nice OEM projects at the moment. So working with some name manufacturers on some aero development for some of their special editions.
So talking road cars here, not race cars?
I'm not going to disclose the details, but it's not, I mean, calling it a road car is a bit weird, but yeah, with OEM projects, you never quite know what timeline they're going to happen on. Some of these projects can be held for years longer than you actually think. So we might still be having this conversation in 3 years of like, oh, it's just about to launch. But yeah, it's, if and when it comes out, it's going to be pretty cool. But yeah, there's some other cool OEM stuff too.
On this note, how frustrating is it for you working on some of these amazing projects, both in F1 and then now outside of F1, where you're really proud of what you're doing, but you just can't tell anyone about it?
Oh, it's immensely frustrating. It's extremely challenging. I wish I could just go out and just tell the world right now, be like, I'm working on this super cool thing. Check this out. It's mad. But yeah, no, it's so frustrating. And like some of these things, like I have projects that I wrapped up like after like over a year development program, and I've wrapped them up like over a year ago, and I still can't say a single thing about them. And it's immensely frustrating.
Guess that also makes it hard to pack out your CV further.
Yeah, well, that's the thing. People are like, well, what have you been doing in this time period? I'm like, there's been stuff, I swear.
Yeah, just been on that white sand beach in Sydney.
Yeah, exactly. So it's tricky, but it is cool working on some really cool projects. I think one of the things that was really cool about F1 was that you would design a part and it would be on the car so soon afterwards that was just really cool. And you could just design a new part and you'd see it on the car really soon afterwards.
Yeah, that must be satisfying.
Yeah. With club level or OEM stuff, the timelines are so much longer.
Yeah, understandable though. All right, second question. Is there any advice you'd give to a younger version of yourself to help reach where you are today in your career faster?
Yeah, there's a few things. I think...
Be born in the UK, I guess.
Yeah, people would be, or just Europe in general would be pretty handy. But no, I think like getting to FSAE or Formula student is really good advice. It's not the mandatory entry to F1 that people used to claim it is, but it is such a good skills booster that's something that I really advocate for.
Honestly, at this point, I would estimate that probably around half the guests I've had on this podcast have gone through Formula SAE. So I wholeheartedly agree. Not just if you're trying to get into Formula One, and it's a stepping stone to all manner of motorsport job openings.
Yeah, well, and the skills you learn are just invaluable. So that's definitely like a hard piece of advice right there. The other one is like just, trying to get experience in like as many and varied things you can do around the motorsport region you're trying to work in. It's like trying to understand a little bit of suspension. Even if you're super into aerodynamics, you should try to get that suspension knowledge, get a bit of engine knowledge, try to understand the whole system. And then the final one is just making the most out of your university teaching. If you're going to university, I know a lot of people that went to university with me. They left the degree and they're like, I didn't really pick up that much. I didn't retain that much. It wasn't very good education. It's like, I did exactly the same degree that they did. And I feel like I picked up so much, and I still use the skills from that degree every day in my job. I think it is what you make of it. Like if you waste your time there, then you're going to feel it later.
So don't turn up to university just to eat your lunch.
Yeah, exactly. You're there to learn, do some learning.
Yeah, and I mean, let's be honest, it's expensive as well to go through a university degree, so you might as well make it pay for itself.
Yeah, exactly. Like there's no point spending all that money and then coming away with nothing but a piece of paper to get just a mediocre job, right?
Correct. All right, Kyle, it's been great. Our last question for today, if people want to follow you and see what you're up to, how are they best to do so? What are your social media accounts, websites, etc.?
Yep. So I have a few different social media channels. I'm not very good at updating them, but anyway, you can find me on Instagram, YouTube, and X as Kyle Engineers. Should be pretty obvious to find me there. And for consulting work, you can go to jkfaero.com, but just be aware that we get an insane volume of emails through there, and the waiting list is about 6 months. So if I don't if I don't respond for a few months, I apologize.
Now, just to set expectations here as well, because I'm guessing a lot of people listening are thinking that your consulting business is really for OE manufacturers and top tier race teams. You do consulting work for club level races as well.
Yeah, so we do club level. So we do club level CFD development kits. So basically working from a 3D scan and then developing the car's aero package from that for you to then manufacture. We also do best practices consulting calls where basically we can just get on the phone and walk you through some stuff in like usually a 1 or 2 hour call and go through that way.
Which we've kind of been leveraging inside of HPA on some duct development for our 86. I just want people to understand that you don't necessarily have to be prepared to shell out tens of thousands or hundreds of thousands of dollars in order to benefit from your consulting experience or consulting knowledge.
Yeah, 100%.
And as usual, we'll put those links into the show notes to make it easy for people to find. Look, Kyle, it's been a pleasure, and I really appreciate your time. Hopefully everyone's learned a little bit more about the ins and outs of Formula One and maybe the ins and outs of how they can make their club level car a little bit faster.
Yeah, well, thanks for having me on. It's been great to be here.
I hope you've enjoyed this episode of Tuned In, and don't forget, by using the code podcast500 at checkout, podcast listeners can get a huge $500 off our VIP package, which includes over 40 current courses, as well as a long list of courses to be released in the future. As a VIP, you'll also get lifetime access to our members-only webinars and our community forum. Lastly, we'd love it if you could drop a review on your chosen podcasting platform. These reviews really help us to grow our audience, and that in turn helps us to continue to get more high quality guests. To say thanks, each week we'll be picking a random reviewer and sending them out an HPA t-shirt free of charge anywhere in the world. This is also a great place to ask any questions you might have too, and I'll do my best to answer them if your review gets picked. So this week, a big shout out to Pavlo VR from the US, who has said the most detailed knowledge sharing in the auto industry. As a former racing engineer and a car tinkerer, there aren't many sources to learn new things from. This being the exception. The host and his guests are exceptionally talented people who don't hold out on secrets to their trade. My absolute favourite to listen to. Well, thanks Matthew for the kind words. Great to hear that you're enjoying the podcast. And if you get in touch with your t-shirt size and shipping details, we'll get a fresh t-shirt shipped straight out to you. All right, that concludes our interview. And before we sign off, I just wanted to mention, for anyone who's been perhaps hiding under a rock and hasn't heard of High Performance Academy before, we are an online training school and we specialize in teaching a range of performance automotive topics, everything from engine tuning and engine building through to wiring, car suspension and wheel alignment, data analysis, and race driver education. Now remember, you've got that coupon code. You can use podcast75 at the checkout to get $75 off the purchase of your first course. You'll find our full course list at hpacademy.com/courses. Important to mention that when you purchase a course from us, that course is yours for life as well. It never expires. You can rewatch the course as many times as you like, whenever you like. The purchase of a course will also give you 3 months of access to our Gold membership. That gives you access to our private members only forum, which is the perfect place to get answers to your specific questions. You'll also get access to our regular weekly members webinars, which is where we touch on a particular topic in the performance automotive realm. We dive into that topic for about an hour. If you can watch live, you can ask questions and get answers in real time. If the time zones don't work for you, that's fine too. You're going to get access as a Gold member to our previous webinar archive. We've got close to 300 hours of existing content in that archive. It is an absolute goldmine. So remember that coupon code podcast75. Check out our course list at hpacademy.com/courses.